The morning sun filtered through the tall, frosted windows of Riverside County Superior Court, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floorboards. It was 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, and the courtroom hummed with an unusual energy, the kind that only emerged when something extraordinary was about to unfold. Judge sat in her high-backed leather chair, her gray hair pulled back neatly, her sharp eyes surveying the crowded gallery with the practiced authority of someone who had spent 32 years presiding over complicated cases. This case, however, was different from anything she had encountered in her lengthy career. The courtroom was packed beyond normal capacity. Reporters occupied the back row, their notebooks poised and ready. Legal scholars from nearby universities occupied several benches, drawn by the unprecedented nature of today's proceedings. Behind them sat concerned citizens who had followed the case through media coverage, fascinated and horrified in equal measure. The air felt thick with anticipation, almost suffocating in its intensity. The case had dominated local headlines for nearly 8 months. Local custody battle TURNS ugly, and ACCUSATONS pile UP in high-profile divorce. The newspapers had screamed, but the reality beneath those sensational headlines was far more tragic than any headline could capture. Sarah and David had been married for 7 years. What had started as a promising union had deteriorated into something ugly and bitter. When they separated 18 months ago, the custody battle that followed became increasingly contentious, increasingly personal, and increasingly focused on allegations of abuse and neglect. David claimed that Sarah was an unfit mother who prioritized her career over their daughter's welfare. He alleged that she had left Emma unsupervised for extended periods, that she had been emotionally negligent, and that she had deliberately attempted to poison Emma's mind against him. Sarah, in turn, countered with far more serious accusations. She claimed that David had become verbally and physically aggressive during their marriage, that he had demonstrated erratic and inappropriate behavior around their young daughter, and that she had legitimate concerns about Emma's safety in his care. She produced medical records, psychological evaluations, and witness statements from family members and friends. The case had gone through multiple hearings. Both parents had psychological evaluations. David came away with a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder with aggressive tendencies, while Sarah was deemed mentally stable but deeply anxious about her daughter's welfare. A court-appointed child psychologist had spent weeks interviewing Emma, conducting observations, and assembling her findings. What that psychologist had discovered was both alarming and complex. Emma displayed signs of anxiety and stress that suggested she had witnessed or experienced something traumatic. But what exactly? Emma herself was unable to articulate her experiences clearly through traditional therapy methods. Her verbal skills, while normal for a 3-year-old, were insufficient to communicate complex emotions and events. Child Protective Services had opened an investigation based on Sarah's allegations, but the investigation had stalled because they lacked clear, definitive evidence from Emma herself. This is where Judge had made her controversial decision. Many legal experts had argued against it vehemently. How could a 3-year-old possibly testify meaningfully in court? Wouldn't the experience be traumatizing? Wouldn't she be too easily influenced by leading questions? The defense attorney, Richard, a slick, silver-haired man in his 50s, had filed multiple motions to exclude Emma's testimony on grounds that she was unreliable and that her presence in court violated the best interests of the child. He had argued passionately that no court should subject a young child to such a stressful environment, particularly one as emotionally fraught as a custody dispute. But Judge had reviewed the research carefully. She had consulted with child psychologists, trauma specialists, and legal experts in child testimony. She had examined case law from jurisdictions that had allowed young children to testify, and she had reached a conclusion that had shocked the legal community. Emma had the right to be heard, and the court had the responsibility to create an environment in which she could speak safely and truthfully. The decision had caused immediate uproar. Legal blogs debated it furiously. Bar associations discussed it at meetings. Sarah's attorney, Williams, a compassionate woman in her early 60s who had built her career defending vulnerable populations, believed firmly in the judge's wisdom. She had worked tirelessly to prepare Emma psychologically for this moment, ensuring the child understood that she could simply tell the truth without fear of consequences. Now, sitting in the courtroom on this Tuesday morning, Sarah occupied the front bench on the plaintiff's side, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a tissue. Her mother sat beside her, offering silent support. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed from weeks of crying and stress. At 42 years old, she looked 10 years older. Her career as a hospital administrator had suffered greatly from the ongoing litigation, though she maintained her position through sheer determination and her supervisor's unwavering confidence in her character. On the opposite side of the courtroom sat David, flanked by his expensive legal team. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and an expression of confidence that bordered on smug. His parents sat behind him, their faces stone-like and judgmental. David had 6 months earlier. His new wife sat in the third row, looking uncomfortable and somewhat bored by the proceedings. David had told the court and the media that he was merely trying to protect his daughter from an unstable mother. He had painted himself as the reasonable parent fighting against false accusations. The media outside the courthouse had been relentless. Satellite trucks lined the street. Reporters practiced their opening statements for the cameras. The story had captured public imagination precisely because it raised such difficult questions about parental rights, childhood trauma, and the limits of the legal system in protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Judge rapped her gavel softly, calling the courtroom to order. It was time to begin. "Let the record show," she said formally, her voice carrying the weight of her 3 decades of judicial experience, "that we are proceeding with the testimony of the minor witness, Emma, age 3 years and 4 months, in the matter of Versus. This proceeding is highly unusual. It is not undertaken lightly. The court has determined that the minor's testimony is material and necessary to justice in this case." She paused, looking directly at Emma's chair, the specially designed one that had been brought in to accommodate her small frame, positioned so that she could see the judge, the attorneys, and be seen by the courtroom without being overwhelmed by the physical space. "Let us proceed carefully, thoughtfully, and with the best interests of the child as our paramount concern." The defense attorney scribbled notes furiously. The reporters leaned forward. Sarah held her breath. Everything, absolutely everything, now hinged on what a 3-year-old girl would say in the next few hours. Emma was brought into the courtroom at 10:15 a.m., exactly 40 minutes after Judge had formally opened the proceedings. A court advocate, a kind woman named Martinez who specialized in children's cases, held Emma's small hand gently as they walked through the side entrance. Emma wore a pink dress that her mother had carefully selected weeks ago, something cheerful but not overly bright, something that wouldn't distract or seem inappropriate for court. Her dark hair was pulled back with a simple white ribbon. She looked impossibly small against the grandeur of the courtroom, a tiny figure dwarfed by towering wooden panels and imposing furniture designed for adults. The moment Emma entered, the entire energy in the courtroom shifted. Reporters ceased their whispered conversations. Legal scholars leaned forward in their seats. Even the court clerk seemed to pause in her work. Everyone's eyes converged on the small child, whose own eyes were wide with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as she took in the overwhelming environment. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her body went rigid with tension, every muscle in her frame coiled tight as a spring. This was her daughter. This was the child she had fought so hard to protect, now being placed in a situation that made every maternal instinct scream at her to gather Emma up and run from the courtroom. Her mother placed a steadying hand on Sarah's shoulder, but Sarah barely felt it. All of her attention was focused on Emma, reading every micro-expression, every slight tremor, monitoring for any sign of distress. On the opposite side, David appeared unmoved, even dismissive. He glanced at Emma briefly, then returned his attention to his attorney, who was whispering something urgent in his ear. His new wife shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly unaccustomed to this level of courtroom drama. His parents, however, watched Emma with expressions that could only be described as calculating, assessing, evaluating, as if trying to determine what their granddaughter might say and whether it would help or hurt their son's case. Martinez led Emma to the specially designed witness chair, a smaller version of the standard witness box, with a cushion to help her sit at an appropriate height. The chair had been positioned carefully so that Emma could see Judge clearly, but also so that she would not be directly facing her father across the courtroom. Psychologists had advised this carefully. Too much visual contact with her father might intimidate her or influence her responses. "Okay, sweetheart," said softly, kneeling down so she was at Emma's eye level. "You're going to sit in this chair right here. Judge is going to ask you some questions, and all you have to do is tell the truth about what you remember. Can you do that?" Emma nodded slowly, her small face serious and concentrated. She had been to practice sessions with child psychologists and the court advocate. She understood, as much as a 3-year-old could, that she was supposed to answer questions honestly. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were two entirely different things. As Emma climbed into the chair, requiring assistance because it was still somewhat high for her, she looked around the courtroom with barely concealed wonder and anxiety. Her eyes landed momentarily on her mother. Sarah offered the most encouraging smile she could muster, though her expression was strained. Emma seemed to gain a tiny bit of confidence from the sight of her mother, her small shoulders dropping slightly as some of the tension left her frame. The court clerk approached with a Bible, having prepared to administer the standard oath. Judge raised her hand, stopping the proceedings. "We'll modify the oath for the minor's understanding," the judge said firmly. She looked directly at Emma. "Emma, do you promise to tell the truth, the real truth, not make-believe stories?" Emma's voice emerged small but clear. "Yes." "Okay," Judge nodded. "That's what I needed to hear." What followed was a careful, methodical process that revealed just how complicated it was to elicit testimony from someone so young. Williams, Sarah's attorney, approached with a tablet displaying pictures. The images were not of courtroom scenes or threatening figures. Instead, they were simple drawings of objects, animals, and scenarios designed to establish that Emma understood the difference between truth and falsehood, between reality and imagination. "Emma, is this picture a dog?" asked gently, showing an image of a puppy. "Yes," Emma said. "Is this picture a horse?" "No, dog." "Good. Now, is the dog real in this picture?" "No, picture," Emma said, displaying the cognitive understanding that images were representations, not reality itself. The questioning continued for several minutes, establishing baseline comprehension and truthfulness. Emma responded with remarkable clarity for her age. She understood real versus pretend, understood that lying was saying something that wasn't true, and understood that she should only say things that really happened. Sarah watched this process with tears streaming silently down her face. Her daughter was so brave, so small, so incredibly vulnerable in this vast system designed for adults. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on her like a physical force. Richard, the defense attorney, made notes on a legal pad, occasionally conferring with an associate. His strategy was clear. He would attempt to undermine Emma's cognitive capacity, plant doubt about her reliability, and suggest that whatever she said had been coached or influenced by her mother. He had prepared meticulously, researching developmental psychology, child suggestibility, and false memory formation in young children. He had every intention of dismantling this testimony piece by piece. After establishing baseline comprehension, Williams shifted her approach. Her voice became even softer, more gentle. "Emma, I want to ask you about something that happened. Do you remember one night when you were at home with Daddy?" Emma's entire body tensed. Her small hands gripped the edges of the witness chair. Everyone in the courtroom noticed the physical reaction, the way her earlier composure seemed to fracture slightly at the mention of her father. Emma prompted gently, "Do you remember?" A long moment of silence followed. Emma's eyes darted involuntarily toward her father, then quickly away, as if the sight of him caused her pain. "Yes," she whispered, so quietly that the court reporter asked her to repeat herself louder. "Yes," Emma said again, her voice trembling slightly. Sarah's grip on her tissue tightened so much that it began to tear. This was it. This was the moment. Everything the case had built toward was about to unfold, hinged on the recollections of a 3-year-old girl who had witnessed something so traumatic that her entire nervous system appeared to be reacting to mere mention of it. The courtroom held its collective breath. The silence that followed Emma's admission seemed to stretch into eternity. Every person in the courtroom appeared to be holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Judge sat perfectly still, her experienced eyes moving between Emma, Williams, and the opposing counsel, monitoring the situation with the care of someone shepherding a delicate process that could collapse at any moment. Williams took a moment before continuing, allowing Emma time to adjust to having confirmed that memory existed. This was crucial. Child psychologists had emphasized that rushing, pressuring, or showing too much emotion could cause a young child to shut down entirely or begin fabricating stories to please the adults around her. The key was patience, gentleness, and allowing Emma to guide the pace. "That's very good," Emma said warmly. "You're doing a really good job. I want to ask you about that night. What I want to know is, where were you?" Emma's small fingers twisted together in her lap. Her eyes remained downcast, focused on her hands as if they held the answers she was searching for. The tension in the courtroom intensified. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Even the court reporter seemed to type more carefully, aware that every sound might distract the child. "Home," Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "At home." "Which home, sweetheart? Were you at Mommy's house or Daddy's house?" "Daddy's," Emma said, and immediately her eyes filled with tears. Her lower lip began to tremble. Sarah's hand shot to her mouth. A strangled sound escaped her throat, a sound of maternal anguish at seeing her daughter in pain. The judge glanced at Sarah with a look that was simultaneously sympathetic and cautionary. Sarah needed to maintain composure, despite every fiber of her being wanting to run to her daughter. Richard leaned back in his chair, observing Emma with an expression that was difficult to read. He made a note on his legal pad, his expression suggesting he was already formulating his cross-examination strategy. The man beside him, a younger associate attorney named Foster, whispered something urgent but waved him off dismissively. He appeared confident, even unconcerned. Emma continued, "Was Mommy there that night?" "No," Emma said, shaking her head. "Mommy not there." "Okay, who was there?" Emma's entire body seemed to contract. Her breathing became slightly more rapid and shallow. Martinez, the court advocate, noticed the signs of distress immediately and prepared to intervene if necessary. This was the critical point, the moment where a young child's nervous system could become so overwhelmed that she would be unable to continue. "It's okay," Emma said softly. "You're safe. You're right here in this big room with lots of people and nobody is going to hurt you. I just want to know who was at the house. Can you tell me?" Emma raised her eyes and they found her mother's face. Sarah offered an encouraging nod, her own tears now flowing freely. Whatever came next, Emma needed to know that her mother was on her side, that she believed her, that she was safe. "Daddy," Emma whispered, and the girl." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. The gallery, which had been silent, suddenly erupted in barely suppressed murmurs. Judge's gavel came down sharply. "Order! I will clear this courtroom if there is another outburst." David's face had gone white. His hand gripped the edge of the counsel table so hard his knuckles appeared bloodless. His attorney's head snapped toward him, and a brief, urgent conversation ensued in hushed tones that the court reporter could not capture. The girl asked carefully, "Do you know what girl?" "Daddy's friend," Emma said, her voice shaking. "Pretty lady." This was information that wasn't in any of the earlier reports. Sarah's attorney exchanged a meaningful glance with her associate. This was new territory, potentially very significant. "Okay," said, maintaining her gentle tone. "And what were Daddy and the pretty lady doing?" Emma's tears began to flow more freely. Her small body was shaking now, though whether from cold, fear, or emotional overwhelm was unclear. "Loud," Emma said. "Very loud, yelling." "They were yelling." "Yes, lots and lots of yelling." "Was Mommy yelling too?" "No," Emma said firmly. "Just Daddy and Lady, Daddy very angry." Sarah covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her mother wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Judge intervened at this point, concerned about Emma's increasing distress. "We're going to take a brief recess," she announced. "Miss Martinez, please ensure the minor is comfortable. We'll resume in 10 minutes. As Martinez helped Emma down from the witness chair, the child immediately began crying harder, her small frame racked with sobs. The courtroom watched this heartbreaking scene. A 3-year-old girl overwhelmed by the weight of her own memories, traumatized by the process of articulating them in a room full of strangers. Sarah moved to stand, but Judge shook her head firmly. "No contact with the minor at this time. You may speak to her after she's at rest." The bailiff led Emma out through the side door, with Martinez holding her hand. Emma looked back toward her mother one final time before disappearing from view, her tear-stained face a haunting image that would remain etched in everyone's mind. The moment the door closed, the courtroom erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet, attempting to exit to call in their stories. Legal scholars debated animatedly what Emma's testimony might mean. David argued heatedly with his attorneys, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Judge gavel came down repeatedly. "Order, order, everyone will remain seated." Williams turned to face her opposing counsel, her expression grim but determined. Richard looked significantly less confident than he had moments before. The introduction of the pretty lady information that hadn't appeared in any discovery documents had shifted the entire landscape of the case. During the recess, both legal teams scrambled, made frantic phone calls to his investigator, demanding immediate background checks on David's recent companions. Williams consulted with child psychologists about Emma's deteriorating emotional state and whether the questioning should continue. When court reconvened 10 minutes later, Emma was brought back. She appeared calmer, though clearly exhausted. Martinez had allowed her to drink some water and had spoken to her reassuringly about her bravery. Williams approached the witness stand once more. "Emma, I know that was hard. We're almost done. I just need to ask you one more thing about that night." Emma nodded weakly, her earlier confidence and curiosity replaced by a kind of resigned compliance. She had been through something traumatic that night, and now she was being forced to relive it. "Did Daddy hurt someone that night?" asked carefully. The courtroom held its breath once more. "Yes," Emma said, her voice no longer trembling but rather flat and emotionless in the way traumatized children sometimes become when overwhelmed. "Daddy hurt the lady. The lady was crying, crying and crying." Sarah's eyes went wide. This was not information she had in her possession. Richard's face had gone ashen. He stood abruptly. "Objection, this is leading the witness and—" "Overruled," Judge said coldly. "You will have opportunity for cross-examination." The tension in the courtroom had become almost unbearable, a pressure so intense it felt like the walls might collapse inward from the weight of it all. The courtroom remained in a state of controlled chaos as Judge reviewed her notes and conferred quietly with the court clerk. Emma sat in her small chair, visibly drained from her testimony. Her eyes were glazed, her shoulders slumped, her emotional reserves clearly depleted. Williams was preparing her next line of questioning, but even she seemed hesitant about continuing to press the traumatized child any further. Richard, the defense attorney, was frantically conferring with his team. Foster had his laptop open, searching for information about the mysterious pretty lady David had been associating with. David himself looked like a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. His new wife had moved several seats away from him, her face showing clear signs of alarm and disgust. She was beginning to understand the true nature of the man she had married. Judge suddenly raised her hand, calling for silence. Everyone in the courtroom immediately, sensing that the judge had made a decision about how to proceed. "We need to pause this line of questioning," Judge announced. "The minor witness is showing signs of significant emotional distress. However, I believe there is critical information that still needs to be elicited. The child appears to be experiencing anxiety and hypervigilance in this environment." She turned to face the courtroom directly. "I am making an order that may be unconventional, but it is based on sound psychological principles and in the best interests of this child. We are going to bring in a certified therapy animal to assist with creating a calmer environment for the minor witness." Gasps erupted from the gallery. Reporters began scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Legal scholars exchanged shocked glances. On the internet, this moment would later be described as the turning point, the judge's bold gamble to help a traumatized child communicate. Richard shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The introduction of an animal into court proceedings is—" "Counsel, I'm aware of your objections before you voice them," Judge interrupted firmly. "I have researched this extensively. Multiple studies demonstrate that the presence of trained therapy animals significantly reduces anxiety in children who are trauma survivors. The animal will be a certified therapy dog, trained specifically for these situations. Its presence does not constitute any form of coaching or contamination of testimony. Sit down." His face flushed with anger, but he made a note on his legal pad, clearly preparing to file an appeal based on this decision later. Sarah looked confused and concerned. "Your Honor, with respect, what exactly are you doing? My daughter is clearly struggling. I don't understand how bringing in an animal will help." Judge's expression softened slightly. "Ms., I understand your concern, but research shows that children who have experienced trauma often feel safer and more secure when accompanied by a trained therapy animal. The dog will remain near your daughter during questioning. It may help her feel less alone, less vulnerable in this intimidating environment." Sarah glanced at Williams, who gave her a subtle nod of assurance. Had been consulted about this decision beforehand. She had reviewed the research and agreed with the judge's reasoning. In fact, had hoped this intervention might be possible. "The court will take a 20-minute recess," Judge declared. "During this time, Officer Duke and his handler will be brought to the courthouse. We will reconvene at precisely 2:15 p.m. The courtroom emptied quickly. Reporters rushed outside, already calling their news desks. "Judge makes unprecedented decision in custody case," the headlines would scream. "Therapy dog brought into courtroom to help 3-year-old testify." In the witness waiting room, Martinez sat with Emma, who was sipping from a juice box and looking exhausted. "Emma, I have something special I want to tell you about," said gently. "In a few minutes, a very special friend is going to come into the courtroom with us. Do you know what a therapy dog is?" Emma shook her head, her eyes showing barely concealed wariness at the thought of something new being introduced to this already frightening situation. "Well, a therapy dog is a very friendly dog who is specially trained to help people feel better when they're scared or sad," explained. "This dog's name is Duke, and he's very, very good at his job. He's going to sit with you while you answer more questions. Having Duke there might help you feel a little bit braver. Would that be okay?" Emma's response was noncommittal, but not negative. She seemed too emotionally exhausted to protest about anything. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Officer James arrived with Duke, a 3-year-old German shepherd of exceptional temperament and training. Duke had been a K-9 unit dog for the police department, but after a minor injury had ended his active patrol career, he had been retrained as a therapy animal. He had hundreds of hours of specialized training to work with traumatized children. He knew how to remain calm, how to project reassurance, and how to respond to a child's emotional state. Officer, a man in his mid-50s with kind eyes and an easy manner, gave Duke a final briefing. "Okay, boy, we've got a little girl in there who's had a really tough time. I need you to be your best self today. Can you do that?" Duke's tail wagged, and he pressed his nose against leg in an expression of devoted affection. In the courtroom, David was arguing vehemently with his attorneys. "This is a setup. This is completely unfair. The dog is going to influence what she says. This is." "Your Honor," said, standing again as the judge returned to her bench, "I must formally object to this procedure. The presence of an animal will prejudice the minor witness. She will say whatever the judge wants her to say because of the psychological comfort provided by the dog. This taints the entire proceeding." Judge looked at him coldly. "Counsel, I appreciate your concern for procedural integrity. However, your objection is noted and overruled. The dog will remain. If you believe this creates grounds for appeal, you are free to pursue that avenue after this case concludes, but we are moving forward." At precisely 2:15 p.m., Officer led Duke into the courtroom. The moment the dog entered, something shifted. Emma's eyes, which had been dull and lifeless from emotional exhaustion, suddenly widened with something that might have been interest. Her posture straightened slightly. She watched as Officer carefully guided Duke toward her chair. "Emma, this is Duke," Officer said warmly. "Duke is here to be your friend while you talk. He's very good at listening." Duke approached slowly, his movements careful and measured. He had done this countless times before. He knew exactly what to do. When he reached Emma's chair, he sat down beside her, positioning himself so that she could easily reach him if she wanted to. He didn't attempt to jump on her or overwhelm her with enthusiasm. Instead, he simply sat, a calm and solid presence. Emma stared at him for a long moment. Then, hesitantly, her small hand reached out and touched his fur. The entire courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Richard made more notes, his expression grim. David looked stricken, as if he somehow understood that this intervention had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the courtroom. Williams approached the witness stand once more. Emma's hand remained on Duke's fur, the connection between girl and dog now established. "Emma," said softly, "I know you've been through a lot today, but I have a few more questions, and I want you to know that Duke is here to help you feel brave while you answer them. Are you ready?" Emma glanced down at Duke, who turned his head slightly to make eye contact with her. In that moment, something remarkable seemed to pass between them, an understanding, a connection, a sense that the dog understood her in a way the adults in the courtroom could not. "Okay," Emma said, her voice stronger than it had been in hours. The questioning was about to resume, but this time, Emma would not be alone. The transformation was almost instantaneous and utterly remarkable to witness. Emma's small hand continued to stroke Duke's soft fur, her fingers moving in gentle, repetitive motions that seemed to calm not just the child, but something deep within her spirit. As she touched the dog, her breathing visibly slowed. Her shoulders, which had been held up near her ears in a posture of pure tension, dropped and relaxed. The hunted, frightened expression that had dominated her face began to soften into something almost resembling calm. Officer remained standing nearby, vigilant but unobtrusive. He had positioned himself slightly to the side, far enough away to give Emma privacy, but close enough to intervene if Duke required any guidance. The dog, however, seemed to know exactly what to do. He remained perfectly still, his warm brown eyes occasionally glancing up at Emma with an expression of profound acceptance and gentleness. Williams waited patiently, giving Emma time to settle into this new dynamic. She had worked with trauma specialists for weeks preparing for this case, and they had all emphasized the importance of patience. A child could only process so much emotional and cognitive information before her systems became overwhelmed. Now, with Duke's presence seemingly providing an anchor to safety, Emma's capacity to communicate appeared to have expanded significantly. "Emma," said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want to ask you about that night again. The night at Daddy's house. Do you remember?" Emma nodded, her eyes still focused on Duke's fur. She continued petting him, and Duke responded by leaning slightly against her leg as if to say, "I'm here. You're not alone." "Can you tell me what happened when Daddy was yelling? What were they yelling about?" For a moment, Emma didn't respond. Her hand paused on Duke's fur. Then she took a deep breath, a child's version of gathering courage, and began to speak. Daddy was mad at the lady," Emma said, her voice still small but noticeably clearer than it had been before. He said she was bad. He said she was a liar." "What was the lady doing?" "She was trying to leave," Emma said, and now the details were coming more freely, as if Duke's presence had somehow unlocked a reservoir of memory that had been locked away. "She said she didn't want to be there anymore. She said Daddy was scary." Williams exchanged a meaningful glance with her associate. This matched Sarah's account. David had invited a woman named Jennifer Torres to his home, and they had argued intensely. But Jennifer had disappeared that night, and she had never given a statement to police. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. "What happened then, Emma? What did Daddy do?" Emma's hand trembled slightly as she continued petting Duke. The dog seemed to sense her rising anxiety and pressed more firmly against her leg, as if anchoring her to the present moment, reminding her that she was safe. "Daddy grabbed her arm," Emma said, her voice becoming even quieter. He was hurting her. She was crying, and I was scared." A profound silence fell over the courtroom. The gallery had completely emptied of whispers. Reporters sat frozen, their phones recording, capturing every word. Legal scholars leaned forward in absolute stillness, understanding they were witnessing something profoundly significant. On the bench, Judge's expression remained neutral, but her eyes had narrowed with intense focus. She was listening to every word, assessing the reliability of Emma's account, noting the consistency and specificity of her details. David had gone completely white. His hands were clenched into fists on the counsel table. His attorney was frantically typing notes, his face the color of ash. Sarah in the gallery had covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her mother held her tightly, whispering words of comfort that no one else could hear. "Where were you when this happened?" asked gently. "In my room," Emma said. "Daddy told me to go to my room, but I came out. I wanted to see. I was scared." "What did you see?" Emma's grip on Duke's fur tightened, and the dog responded by turning his head to look at her directly, his liquid brown eyes communicating patience and acceptance. Emma took another deep breath, drawing strength from the animal beside her. "I saw Daddy pushing her. She fell down, she was on the floor, and Daddy was on top of her, and she was crying and saying, 'Stop, stop, please stop.'" A strangled sob escaped Sarah's throat. Williams paused, allowing the weight of Emma's words to settle over the courtroom. "Did Daddy stop?" asked carefully. "No," Emma whispered. "He didn't stop. He was hurting her really bad." Richard stood abruptly. "Objection. This testimony is speculative. The minor is describing something she couldn't possibly understand. She's using language that clearly indicates coaching." "Overruled," Judge said coldly. Sit down, counsel. The witness is describing what she observed. The interpretation of those observations is for the court to determine. Continued with surgical precision. Emma, what happened after that, after Daddy was on top of the lady? Emma was quiet for a long moment. Her fingers had stopped moving on Duke's fur, and the dog gently nudged her hand with his nose, encouraging her to continue the soothing motion. She resumed petting him, and her breathing steadied once more. The lady stopped crying, Emma said. She stopped moving. Daddy got off her, he looked scared, he looked at me. Sarah's hand shot to her mouth. She had never known that Emma had witnessed the assault directly. Emma had mentioned being frightened and hearing crying, but not this level of detail, not this level of traumatic exposure for her baby. What happened when Daddy saw you? Asked. He said I was a bad girl, Emma said, and now tears were flowing freely down her cheeks. He said if I told anybody, Mommy would go away forever. He said I would never see Mommy again. He said it would be my fault. The courtroom erupted in reaction. Judge Gavel came down hard. Order, I will clear this courtroom. The gallery quieted, but the damage was done. Everyone understood the implications. David had not only allegedly assaulted Jennifer Torres, but he had also threatened and traumatized his own daughter to ensure her silence. He had weaponized a child's love for her mother, using it as a tool of manipulation and control. Emma was shaking now, great sobs racking her small frame, but Duke remained steady beside her, his presence unwavering. The dog's head rested gently against her leg, communicating wordlessly, "You are brave. You are safe. Your words matter." "That's okay," Emma said softly. "You're doing so well, you're so brave. I just have one more question. When Daddy told you that Mommy would go away, what did he tell you to do?" Emma looked down at Duke, and the dog's eyes met hers with perfect understanding. She took a shuddering breath. He said, don't tell anybody. He said it was our secret." There it was, the core of the manipulation, the threat, the trauma. A 3-year-old child had been forced to keep a devastating secret under threat of losing her mother forever. Richard looked like a man watching his case collapse in real time. Judge leaned forward, her expression grave and determined. This was the moment everything changed. Williams paused deliberately, allowing Emma's words to reverberate through the courtroom. The young prosecutor understood the psychology of testimony. Sometimes the most powerful moments required silence, space for the truth to settle into people's consciousness without interruption or commentary. She glanced at Judge, reading the subtle nod that indicated should continue. "Emma, you did something very brave today," said softly. "You told us the truth, and that took a lot of courage, thank you." Emma's small face crumpled slightly at the acknowledgement of her bravery. She continued stroking Duke's fur, and the dog remained perfectly still, his presence a constant reassurance. Officer stood nearby, his eyes reflecting deep compassion for the traumatized child. "I have no further questions at this time," announced, returning to her seat. The moment had arrived that everyone in the courtroom had been dreading, the cross-examination. Richard stood slowly, gathering his notes. His earlier confidence had been shattered, but he was a skilled attorney who had handled difficult situations before. He understood that his job now was to undermine Emma's testimony, plant seeds of doubt, and suggest that her recollections had been contaminated by coaching, suggestion, or false memory. But he also understood that he had to be careful. This was a 3-year-old child. The gallery was packed with journalists who would report every word. Any appearance of bullying or aggressive tactics could backfire spectacularly and turn public opinion against both him and his client. Ms. began, deliberately using formal language, a subtle tactic to create distance and undermine rapport. "I want to ask you some questions about what you've told us today." Emma said nothing, but her grip on Duke's fur tightened slightly. The dog responded by turning his head slightly, meeting her eyes with a look of steady support. When you were in your room that night, how long were you there before you came out? Asked. I don't know, Emma said simply. Long time. How long? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour? I don't know, Emma repeated, her voice small. Just long time. Made notes, suggesting that the child's inability to provide specific indicated unreliability. It was a standard tactic. If you can't find inconsistencies in the facts, highlight uncertainties in the details. And when you came out of your room, did you see everything that was happening or just part of it? I saw, Emma said firmly. I saw Daddy hurting the lady. Did you see the beginning of what happened between your father and the lady? No, Emma admitted, just in the middle. So you don't actually know how the interaction started, correct? You don't know if the lady attacked your father first. No, Emma said, her voice becoming slightly distressed. The lady was scared. She said stop. But you don't actually know the context of the situation, do you? You only saw a portion of events. William stood. Objection. The attorney is arguing with the witness and attempting to confuse her with sophisticated linguistic traps that a 3-year-old cannot be expected to navigate. Sustained, Judge said sharply. Counsel, I'm going to give you one warning. This is a 3-year-old child. You will ask clear, simple questions without attempting to manipulate her through linguistic complexity. Continue. His jaw tightened, but he pressed on. Emma, did your mommy ever tell you what to say today? No, Emma said. Did anyone tell you what to say? No, just tell truth, Emma said, and there was something in her voice, a simple, pure statement that cut through all of his attempts at sophistication. Did the dog help you feel less scared? Yes, Emma said. And because the dog made you feel less scared, could you have said things that weren't exactly true, just to keep talking? No, Emma said firmly, I tell truth. But you just said you couldn't remember how long you were in your room. That doesn't sound like exact truth. That's different, Emma said, with the kind of childlike logic that was somehow more credible than sophisticated legal reasoning. I don't remember time, but I remember what I saw, Daddy hurting the lady. That's truth. Pressed on for another 20 minutes, but Emma's testimony held firm. Where she was uncertain, she said so clearly. Where she was certain, she remained unwavering. And through it all, Duke remained beside her, a physical embodiment of her courage. Finally, seemed to recognize that his cross-examination was not achieving the desired effect. If anything, Emma's steadfastness under questioning was making her testimony appear more credible, not less. No further questions, he said finally, his voice carrying a note of defeated resignation. Judge leaned forward, looking directly at Emma. Emma, I want to thank you for coming here today and for telling the truth. What you've done took a lot of courage. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes, Emma said softly. You did a very good job, Judge said, and her voice carried genuine warmth and respect. You can go with Miss Martinez now. As Martinez approached to help Emma down from the witness chair, Emma turned to Duke and wrapped her small arms around the dog's neck in a tight embrace. Duke's tail wagged slightly, acknowledging the child's gratitude and affection. The entire gallery watched this moment in silence. Photographs would later capture it, a small child clinging to a large dog, both of them transformed by their brief connection. That image would appear in newspapers, on news broadcasts, and across social media, becoming the visual embodiment of the case itself. As Emma was led from the courtroom, she looked back one final time at Duke, who sat watching her depart with an expression of serene calm. Officer placed his hand on Duke's head, and the dog leaned against the officer's leg, seeming to understand that his job was complete. The courtroom seemed to exhale, but Judge was not finished. We will now hear from the remaining witnesses, she announced. The prosecution wishes to call to the stand Officer Michael Torres. A man stood from the gallery, a detective who had been investigating the disappearance of Jennifer Torres, the woman Emma had described. He had been waiting for this moment, armed with crucial evidence that Emma's testimony had just corroborated. David looked like a man watching the walls of his world collapse. His attorney was making frantic calls on his phone, clearly preparing damage control and legal strategy for appeals and potential criminal charges. The new wife was no longer sitting with him. She had moved to the opposite side of the gallery, her disgust and betrayal evident in every rigid line of her posture. As Officer Torres was sworn in, William stood to begin her direct examination. This would be the moment when the legal and criminal implications of David's actions would be laid bare, when Emma's testimony would be corroborated by evidence, when the full picture of what had happened that night 6 months ago would finally emerge. Officer Torres looked grimly determined. He had been searching for Jennifer Torres for months. He had evidence, witnesses, and now, finally, he had a child's eyewitness account that might finally provide the breakthrough the case had desperately needed. "Officer Torres," said, "please tell the court what you've discovered regarding the disappearance of Jennifer Torres on the night of September 14th of last year." Torres took a deep breath. "We found her," he said simply. "We found what happened to her." The courtroom fell silent once more. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Judge's expression became even more grave. This testimony would change everything that followed. The 2 words Emma had spoken "Daddy did" had not only exposed David's violence. They had potentially uncovered a crime far more serious than anyone had imagined. Officer Michael Torres was sworn in, and Judge observed him carefully as he took his seat in the witness box. Torres was a detective with 20 years of experience, and his bearing reflected that. Calm, professional, yet with an underlying intensity that suggested he carried the weight of unsolved cases. He had been assigned to the Jennifer Torres disappearance case, no relation to the officer, though the shared surname had created an odd resonance in his determination to solve it. Williams approached with measured steps. "Officer Torres, how long have you been investigating the disappearance of Jennifer Torres?" 6 months, Torres replied. "Since March 15th of this year. Her family reported her missing after she failed to show up for work for 3 consecutive days. It was unusual. Jennifer was a responsible person, reliable, never missed work without calling." "And in those 6 months, what have you discovered?" Torres pulled out his notebook, though he clearly knew the contents by heart. "We determined that Jennifer had been seeing David, the defendant, for approximately 2 months prior to her disappearance. According to interviews with her family and friends, Jennifer had expressed concerns about the relationship. She indicated that David had become increasingly controlling, jealous, and prone to angry outbursts." "Did you locate Jennifer Torres?" asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "We did," Torres said. "Her remains were discovered 3 weeks ago during a search of David's property, specifically a remote wooded area approximately 2 miles behind his residence. She had been buried approximately 5 months ago, consistent with the timeline of her disappearance." The courtroom erupted. Sarah began sobbing openly. Even Judge appeared momentarily shaken by the confirmation of what had been suspected but not yet proven. The gallery exploded in exclamations of shock and horror. Judge's gavel came down hard. "Order! I will clear this courtroom if necessary." Richard looked like he might be physically ill. David had gone so white that court personnel seemed prepared to call medical assistance. He appeared to be hyperventilating, his hands gripping the counsel table so hard the knuckles were completely bloodless. "Officer Torres," continued once order was restored, "what evidence did you recover from the site?" "Forensic evidence consistent with the victim, clothing belonging to Jennifer Torres, items from her purse, personal effects. Dental records confirmed the identity of the remains. We also discovered evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull consistent with repeated striking by a heavy object." "Did you recover the weapon?" "We did. A sledgehammer was found buried nearby. Forensic analysis shows traces of blood and tissue consistent with the victim's DNA profile. Paused, allowing this information to settle. Officer Torres, based on your investigation, what is your conclusion regarding the cause of Jennifer Torres' death? Richard shot to his feet. Objection. That calls for speculation. The officer is not qualified to render cause of death conclusions. That's within the purview of the medical examiner. Sustained, Judge said. Rephrase the question, counsel. What did the medical examiner determine regarding the cause of death? Asked. Blunt force trauma, Torres said. Multiple strikes to the head. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment is that death occurred within minutes of the initial trauma. Jennifer would have suffered significantly before losing consciousness. Sarah covered her face with both hands, her entire body shaking with sobs. The implications were staggering. Emma had witnessed not just assault, but the beginning of what would culminate in murder. Officer Torres said carefully, does the timeline you've established align with the testimony we heard earlier today from the minor witness? It does, Torres said firmly. The child's description of events, the location, the time of day, the nature of the violence, all aligns with our evidence. The child's account is consistent with the forensic findings. No further questions, said, but before she sat down, she added, Your Honor, I move that the evidence obtained from the Torres residence be entered into the record as Exhibits A through M. Judge nodded. So ordered, the exhibits will be entered into evidence. Richard's cross-examination was brutally short. There was nothing to challenge. The forensic evidence was conclusive. The timeline was established. The remains had been identified. The cause of death was determined. To press further would only cement his client's guilt in the minds of the observers. No questions, said his voice hollow. Williams then called to the stand the lead forensic investigator, Dr., who provided detailed testimony about the forensic evidence. She explained how dental records had been used to confirm identity, how DNA analysis had been conducted, how the pattern of injuries suggested a person in a state of extreme rage. The violence was extreme, Doctor. Whoever delivered these blows was in a state of significant emotional agitation. The pattern suggests repeated strikes, not a single incident. This was sustained, intense violence. After Doctor's testimony, called a social worker who had been working with Emma, documenting her emotional and behavioral changes since the incident. The social worker that Emma displayed classic symptoms of childhood trauma, nightmares, anxiety, behavioral regression, signs of complex PTSD. Has the child received any leading suggestions about what to say in court? Asked. No, the social worker said firmly. In fact, we've been very careful to allow Emma to express her experiences in her own words, without prompting or suggestion. Any indication that she was being coached would have compromised our therapeutic work with her. The prosecution's case was airtight. Every piece of testimony supported every other piece. Emma's account had been corroborated by physical evidence, forensic analysis, and expert testimony. When it came time for to present the defense, he was in an impossible position. He had no witnesses who could contradict the evidence. He had no expert who could challenge the forensic findings. He had nothing but the defendant himself, a man who sat pale and trembling, clearly understanding the enormity of the situation he faced. David's own testimony was a disaster. When confronted with the evidence, he attempted to claim that Jennifer's death had been accidental, a result of him trying to restrain her during a struggle. But his account contradicted itself repeatedly. He couldn't explain the sledgehammer. He couldn't explain the burial. He couldn't explain the threats he had made to Emma. By the time's cross-examination was complete, the outcome seemed inevitable. Judge adjourned the court for the day, indicating that she would render her decision the following morning. But everyone in the courtroom understood what that decision would be. That evening, news broadcasts across the region led with the same headline: "Stunning testimony from 3-year-old girl uncovers murder." Photographs of Emma and Duke dominated the news cycle. Legal commentators debated the significance of the case. The media coverage was relentless and comprehensive. At home, Sarah held Emma close, whispering that she was safe now, that her bravery had made a difference, that the truth had finally come out. Emma, exhausted and emotionally drained, fell asleep in her mother's arms, Duke's presence in their home providing a final layer of emotional security and comfort. The following morning, Judge delivered her ruling. She awarded full custody to Sarah, with supervised visitation by David restricted indefinitely pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. The judge's language was scathing in her description of David's manipulation, violence, and endangerment of his own child. But the most significant ruling came when Judge referred the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. The evidence was sufficient to proceed with charges of murder in the second degree, assault, and child endangerment. David was remanded into custody without bail, pending trial. As he was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, he looked back at Emma sitting in her mother's arms. For just a moment, his gaze held hers, and in that moment, Emma seemed to understand that her truth had changed everything. The girl who had been silenced by threats had found her voice, and that voice had brought justice. 3 months after the trial concluded, Sarah stood on the back porch of her newly renovated home, watching Emma play in the yard. The house had been purchased with funds obtained through a civil settlement with David's estate, money that felt like both restitution and blood money. Sarah had donated a portion of it to a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting child trauma survivors, ensuring that other children would have access to the resources Emma had received. Emma was different now. Not entirely healed, trauma didn't work that way, Sarah understood, but different in the ways that mattered. The nightmares had decreased significantly. The anxiety that had previously made her cling to her mother constantly had softened into a more age-appropriate independence. She laughed more easily. She played with genuine joy rather than performing normalcy. Most remarkably, Emma had specifically requested to continue visiting Duke. Officer, recognizing the profound therapeutic bond between the child and the dog, had worked with the police department and the courthouse to arrange special therapy sessions. Once a month, Emma would visit Duke at the police station, and the two would spend time together in a comfortable room designed for these interactions. The dog seemed to remember the girl, greeting her with the same gentle enthusiasm he had shown in the courtroom. Dr. Sarah, Sarah's older sister, a child psychologist who had provided expert testimony in the case, had published a research paper about Emma's experience, titled Therapy Animals and Child Testimony, examining the effectiveness of canine-assisted communication in traumatized children. The paper had already begun to influence how courts and child protection services approached cases involving young witnesses. Universities requested her to speak about the case. Law schools discussed it in courses on evidence and child testimony. Legal journals published articles debating the implications. Judge had received numerous accolades for her decision to allow the therapy dog in court. She had been invited to present at judicial conferences across the country. Her ruling had already been cited in 3 separate state court cases involving young witnesses. Legal scholars argued that her decision represented a paradigm shift in how courts could balance the need for testimony with the protection of vulnerable witnesses. The trial of David for the murder of Jennifer Torres was scheduled to begin in 6 months. However, David had surprised everyone by accepting a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder and assault in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His attorney had recognized that the evidence against him was overwhelming, that a jury trial would result in conviction anyway, and that sparing Emma the trauma of testifying again was a mercy of sorts. When Sarah had been informed of the plea deal, she had wept, not tears of joy, but complex tears reflecting gratitude that Emma would be spared further courtroom trauma, mixed with frustration that there would be no jury to hear the full story. But Williams, her attorney, had explained the practicality. A guilty plea ensured that David would spend the rest of his life in prison. There was no appeal strategy that could overturn a plea. There was no jury that might be swayed by sophisticated defense arguments. There was only certainty. The plea deal had brought an unexpected peace. Jennifer Torr's family had finally been able to have a proper funeral, to grieve without the uncertainty of a trial hanging over their heads. They had reached out to Sarah privately, thanking her for helping them understand what had happened to their daughter. Sarah had cried with them, connecting over the shared experience of having their lives destroyed by David's violence. In the weeks following the trial, Sarah had returned to her job as a hospital administrator with cautious optimism. Her supervisor had supported her completely, understanding the extraordinary circumstances of her situation. Her colleagues had welcomed her back with genuine warmth, having followed the case in the media and recognizing the courage both Sarah and Emma had demonstrated. The media attention had been relentless initially, but it had eventually faded into the background as new stories captured public attention. However, the case remained in the legal consciousness. Legal associations used it as a teaching tool. Child advocacy organizations cited it in their advocacy efforts. The case had become a landmark example of how trauma-informed legal practices could serve justice while protecting vulnerable witnesses. 1 year after the trial, Emma attended kindergarten for the first time. Sarah had worried about how the other children would treat her, whether they would have somehow absorbed the sensationalized version of her story that had been splashed across news outlets. But Emma had proven resilient in ways that even surprised her mother. She made friends. She participated in classroom activities. She was, to most observers, an ordinary 5-year-old girl beginning her formal education. Yet Emma carried something within her that was extraordinary, a kind of quiet wisdom that sometimes emerged in unexpected moments. When other children were upset, Emma had a gift for comforting them. When teachers spoke about telling the truth, Emma listened with particular attention. She had experienced something that most children never did, and it had marked her in ways both visible and invisible. On the second anniversary of the trial, a documentary filmmaker approached Sarah about creating a feature documentary about the case. Sarah initially declined, protective of Emma's privacy and her own need for normalcy. But after careful consideration and after extensive consultation with Emma's therapist and child psychologists, Sarah agreed, with strict conditions. Emma's face would not be shown. Her identifying information would be protected. The focus would be on the legal and psychological innovations that had made her testimony possible, rather than exploiting her trauma for entertainment. The resulting documentary, The Two Words, premiered at a film festival and then aired on a major streaming platform. It received critical acclaim for its thoughtful examination of child testimony, trauma-informed legal practices, and the role of therapy animals in supporting vulnerable witnesses. Legal scholars cited it. Child advocates showed clips in training sessions. It became an educational tool used to help other professionals understand the intersection of trauma, testimony, and justice. But for Sarah and Emma, the most meaningful outcome came in a different form. 3 years after the trial, Officer James brought Duke to visit them at home. The dog had aged slightly, his muzzle showing gray, but his spirit remained warm and gentle. Emma, now 8 years old, was overjoyed at the sight of her old friend. She threw her arms around Duke's neck, and the dog leaned into the embrace with the same steadiness he had shown in the courtroom years before. Shared news: Duke was retiring from active therapy work due to his age. A younger dog was being trained to take his place, but Duke's legacy had already been secured. He had become something of a legend among therapy dog handlers, the dog who had helped a traumatized child testify, the dog whose presence had helped bring a murderer to justice. Sarah served tea on the porch while Emma and Duke played in the yard. shared that the courthouse had received multiple requests from other cases for the use of therapy animals during child testimony. A formal program was being developed to train and deploy dogs specifically for this purpose. Duke had sparked a movement. "You know," said thoughtfully, "I've worked in law enforcement for 30 years. I've seen a lot of cases, but I've never seen anything quite like what happened with Emma. She was so small, so vulnerable, and yet she found a way to speak her truth." Sarah nodded, watching her daughter play with the dog who had given her courage. "I think Duke deserves a lot of the credit, but Emma was the brave one. She's always been the brave one." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Emma sat beside Duke, her small hand resting on his soft fur. The dog's eyes were closed, but his tail wagged slowly, as if even in rest he was communicating contentment and peace. In that moment, Sarah understood something profound. Justice had been served, not just in the courtroom, not just through legal rulings and guilty pleas, but in the healing of her daughter, in the peace that had finally come, in the knowledge that Emma's 2 words "Daddy did" had changed the trajectory of her own life and the lives of countless others who would benefit from the legal innovations her case had inspired. The girl who had been silenced by fear had become a symbol of courage. And she had done it with a dog by her side, reminding her that she was never truly alone. The end.